Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast, where every day we probe the intersecting avenues of technology, business and real-world problem solving. I'm your host, Neil C. Hughes, and today we've got a guest who is at the forefront of customer experience transformation in the digital realm. Allow me to introduce you to today's guest, and his name is Az Raj, and he's the EMEA CMO of Merkle and the UK and Ireland CMO of a company called Dentsu. And with an illustrious career spanning over 2 decades, Az brings a wealth of knowledge and thought leadership to the table. He's a contributor to major platforms from Forbes, Campaign, The Drum, and so many others. And if that's not enough, he's also co-authored a recently published book called Shift: Transform Motion into Progress in Business. But today we're going to delve into the pretty eye-opening talking points that Az has got to share around the evolving challenges that he faces as a CMO in today's rapidly changing business landscape. And we'll also dissect the intriguing notion that the campaign as we know it is dead, and explore how businesses should focus on solving problems and building trustworthy brands. And we'll also touch on the old adage of ready, aim, fire, and why it might not hold as much water as it did, especially for agile and flexible business strategies. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the UK, where you can join me and Az in conversation, where we'll explore all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Neil. So I'm Az. I am the CMO for Dentsu across UK and Ireland, and I actually double hat as the CMO for Merkle across EMEA. So Dentsu is an agency network, and Merkle is one of the agencies within that network that sort of specializes in data, technology, and using that to sort of build customer experiences and putting the understanding of consumers at the heart of what we do.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And one of the things that put you on my radar was when I was reading that you mentioned that the concept of a campaign is now outdated and the focus should now be on solving problems. So can you elaborate on how both at Merkle and Dentsu you've adapted this philosophy and how that approach differs in execution and measurement from that traditional campaign?
Yeah, I think campaigns, if we think historically in the way that brands have used campaigns, they tend to be focused on what the business is trying to sell. So and I don't necessarily mean an emotive, creative campaign here, because that's slightly different. But just thinking about how if we send either an email campaign or something through a website or whatever the technology might be that we're using, it's generally for the purpose of selling something in most cases when a campaign's involved. And if you think about what we're trying to do now and where the expectations of consumers are, it's much more around the challenge that we're trying to solve for. And I think to be able to do that effectively, we need to pivot from campaigns and move towards experiences and addressing that consumer need. Because I think it's just becoming more prevalent now that brands need to align to consumer values, in the context of their products and services, but also, what's really important to them. I talk about this a little bit as well, but I remember when I went to buy a pair of slippers, very interesting here. When I was looking for a pair of slippers, I only had two pieces of criteria, really. One was I had to like the look of them, and the second one is they had to be comfortable. Pretty, basic for a pair of slippers. Yeah. But when I bought them, or whether the pair that I eventually found, they were vegan slippers. And the price of the slippers weren't that different to a regular pair of slippers. And, when I was presented that, I liked the look of them, they were comfortable. And because the price was roughly the same, why wouldn't I do the right thing? So it's just thinking about how does that start to play into, thinking about what's right for the consumer as well.
Completely agree. And as you're a bit of an Essex guy there, I'm surprised you didn't say Ugg slippers to throw that into good mix as well. But there's a different conversation for another day. But it's seriously though, I completely agree. And I find your approach incredibly refreshing. And I also read that you challenged the conventional wisdom of ready, aim, fire in a marketing strategy too. So can you provide maybe a few examples where the reverse or just a different combination has worked better, and also how businesses know when to maybe deviate from that traditional sequence?
Yeah, because if we think about just ready, aim, fire, in the context of you shooting a bow and arrow, for example, you sort of set up the bow, you take your time to get ready for it, then you start to aim, and then you fire. That whole process can be quite slow. And in the context of business, that isn't always the right thing. It doesn't mean you have to run at 100 miles an hour, because you have to think about doing the right things. But the ability to adapt that becomes quite important. And if you think about the different combinations of those words, whether it's ready, fire, aim, fire, ready, there are different ways that you could handle it. So as an example, you don't have to take the shot straight away. You can actually see how your competitors take the shot first and then fire beforehand. So you fire based on their aiming rather than your own. And I think a good example of that is something like the iPod. We're going back in time a little bit, but the MP3 player was out for a long time, and it wasn't quite getting it right. The iPod saw the opportunity, or Apple saw the opportunity with the iPod still, and still managed to make it work because they fixed the challenge that they saw with the MP3 player, because you couldn't navigate music in the MP3 player effectively. The MP3 player solved the problem of not having to carry the tapes around with a Walkman, but it meant that you still couldn't look at your music in the right way. The storage wasn't very big. The iPod solved the storage issue, it solved the navigation issue, and that's what made it take off, by seeing what the MP3 player did first. And I think that's just a good example where you don't necessarily have to be a first mover. You can just be the first business to get it right.
And you've also declared that strategy is dead, and almost emphasised the importance of agility in this modern digital age that we all find ourselves. So how does that manifest it in the roles that you have now, and what frameworks or technologies are you finding enable this newfound flexibility?
Yeah, it's a controversial statement, isn't it? Yeah. And I think it's probably we do say that, but it's probably more the fact that we need to look at how strategy has to evolve. There was a phrase you probably heard by Peter Drucker, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think also purpose sort of eats culture to a certain extent. So I think that's the first part. I think it's thinking about strategy in a different light, and thinking about the purpose that business is trying to solve for, or what it stands for, most importantly. And I think once you have that purpose, it's about understanding that you need multiple strategies that align to that purpose. And that will vary by consumer, by industry, by capability, depending on what you need to deliver. That will start to vary. And that means that you can flex and you can have that agility as you're coming through. I think when you look at businesses, just thinking about the frameworks part of that question, a lot of businesses try to do agile as an example. But agile is generally with a small a, and it's the way that you run a sprint, and you will deliver technology based on an agile process rather than waterfall. But it's still about delivering functionality. So how can you start to think about making sure that you're delivering the right things based on the purpose that you're trying to deliver and what the customer needs? And I think that's the difference that we're doing here. So you're trying to deliver something of value rather than a piece of functionality or tool.
And although we have said a few controversial things today about the traditional marketing strategies out there, if we strip everything back, ultimately it's about addressing customer pain points. So can you tell me a little bit more about key technologies or methods that you're using at Merkle and Dentsu to better understand and address those customer pain points, but in real time?
Yeah, of course. And it does vary. And I think you're absolutely right. It is about addressing those pain points, and also probably on the flip side, addressing or reinforcing the things that are going well. But it does vary depending on, I guess, whether you're looking for us as Dentsu as an organization, or whether you look at how we help our clients, because there's a bit of a mix of B2B and B2C, and there is a slight nuance around both. But I'll give an example for both. For B2B, I think it's understanding what is relevant for brands. Now, we use a tool called Bombora that allows us to understand what content brands are interested, so that we can help map our thought leadership to that. So that means we're starting to drive added value to those brands by understanding what their real challenges are. When it comes to helping our clients, especially in the consumer space as well, we've got a tool called CCS, which is our consumer panel, which asks questions to a large number of consumers that helps us understand their motivations and intent, so that we can start to think about our planning processes and making sure that we do the things that are important to the consumers again, and start to target them in the right way, start to deliver them the content that they need in the right way, and start to deliver the experience that's important for them. And then probably the big one that comes to mind is our technology called Mercury, which is our identity platform. And that allows us to authentically and compliantly understand our customers with what we know about them, and build up that picture, because identity isn't just about recognition. I think that's something that happens quite a bit in the industry right now. So going back to the pain points, we recognize customers, but we don't fully understand what their challenges are. It's about understanding and gaining knowledge of them so that we can help them and fully get to grips with their intent and their expectation so that we can deliver what's needed.
And I'm glad you mentioned compliance there, because another big talking point right now is challenges around and responsibility with data and privacy. So given your involvement with the Data and Marketing Association, I'm curious, what are the major challenges and also ethical considerations, of course, regarding data collection and customer experience today, and how are these challenges being addressed?
I think, that's a big question. I think,
it's almost an episode on its own.
It could be. I think the first one that comes to mind is the cookie deprecation. It's the most obvious one.
Yeah.
And that authentic movement from third to first party data. You often see brands talking about their data that say, we've got this amount of data. Is that enough? What is it enough for what? Because it depends on what you're trying to achieve and why you're going to use it and the value that you're going to drive. And then when you were trying to collect more data, that is another ask. So why are you trying to do that? And what is the purpose? And how do you prioritize the data that you collect? Because there's got to be a value to the consumer. And thinking about that whole consumer value is the perception of that value for the consumer has to be greater than the data that we asked for. So we need to then provide them the transparency on how we use that data and making sure there's a whole process that sits around it. And that provides that authenticity and that builds the trust, which is incredibly important with consumers now. And that sort of ties into, the other point around AI being such a big sort of topic at the moment as well, and trust being a real thing within AI. And how do we start to generate that trust? Because all brands are looking at it. I think as an industry, we're quite fragmented in the way that we're looking at AI right now. So brands are trying to test it, understand how they do it quickly and how they do it as safely as possible. But how do they start to think about an integrated strategy that is of benefit to the consumer and puts that trust at the heart of it? I think will be quite key as well.
And before you came on the podcast today, I was doing a little research on you. Yes, I was Googling you, but I did come across some great things and standout career moments, because I saw that you were recognised in, I think it was Performance In's top 50 list for marketers. And this got me thinking, I always try and get my guests to look back at their career. Was there a pivotal moment in your career that maybe helped shape your disruptive views on marketing? Because I feel there's almost a story there, right?
Yeah, there is. I think there's probably a couple of different moments. It's probably been an incremental growth rather than one key moment. But I think it first started probably, near the start of my career, actually. I just saw the opportunity to bring the creative side of what we do with the analytical side of what was available, the data that was coming through, because digital analytics had just started at that point, and the insights that were available to feed into the creative side. I just saw that because I sort of sit in the middle of business, creative, and technology. Probably not as good as anybody either of them, but I sort of blend in the middle somewhere.
Yeah.
And it gives me the opportunity to think about it in that light. And I think that was a key point because I saw the opportunity of driving more value as a result of that. And also just doing really interesting work that got me excited, as well as delivering something that was very different for the business. So I think that was one of the key moments. And probably the second big one, was actually writing the book as well. I think that was a big moment for me. It gave me the opportunity to write down my experience and my points of view, because you don't often get a chance to do that in one place, because you do it in meetings, you talk about it, you write things down, you do it in white papers or thought leadership that you might, but never in one place. And, the ability to write that and with a colleague and a friend meant that we were able to evolve that thinking as well and bounce ideas. So it sort of amplified that process, which I really enjoyed.
Now, given your position as a thought leader, what strategic advice would you offer to marketers specifically in the tech space and where product cycles and consumer expectations might possibly differ?
I think we often focus on the functionality or outputs, especially when it comes to technology. We might deliver a sprint, for example, with a set of features, or we want to be able to deliver a specific type of campaign or a search function on a website, whatever it might be. I think moving that mindset around functionality, which, as you say, changes by product or changes by business or by industry, to focusing on the outcome that you're trying to achieve and then work backwards. I think if you can use that as your value compass to work out how you prioritize, I think that will help. And I think that applies across any industry and helps manage any expectation from a consumer, because that allows you to be more adaptive and to be able to respond in a different way. I heard this phrase the other day about, and I think it especially applies to technology, that we often put out roadmaps. And that roadmap tends to be quite fixed because it's the way that you're looking at it. Instead, we need to pivot to having a sat nav. So if we can have a sat nav that adapts to the traffic and everything else, I think that's the way to look at it. And if you've got the final outcome in mind, that frames the entire business to be able to respond around it.
And of course, we are starting to think about life in 2024, which always seems to trigger us into doing things differently, exploring innovative approaches, etc. And I appreciate you're probably locked down to what you can share with us today, but is there anything you can give us a sneak peek into, especially around any groundbreaking work that you're currently involved in? Perhaps something that aligns with your recently published book called Shift that I was reading about too. Is there anything you can share about the road ahead?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what is emerging right now. And I think the big topic that we said is AI. I think, and Gen AI in particular, is coming up more and more. And I think that's where a lot of innovation will come from for a lot of organizations. Once we really get our arms around it and crack some of the key elements to it, is such a strong area. And I think it's going to reframe how we work as organizations as a whole. And I think it will also change the way that we even need to look at the skill sets that are required. But we've just, as a good example, we've just launched a tool called Artemis, which is part of our creative business, and it allows brands to upload their creative assets. And then it uses AI to predict the performance of any new assets that they create. So if you think about that in the context of what I just said, it starts to think about how creativity comes together and how it can, incrementally add to the creative minds that you have in the business as well. So it starts to enrich different parts of your business and how you can start to leverage the skills that you've got, and even start to maybe adapt, not maybe this tool in particular, but other AI tools can start to think about how you can get other skill sets and be more inclusive with your skills that you've got in the organization as well. So for example, do you need developers that can write code, or do you need developers that can maybe write into AI? It's a slightly different sort of view, but I think that will be a key thing moving forward.
Well, as I said earlier in our conversation, you're a real breath of fresh air, and I love how you're getting people to think differently about marketing and MarTech. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time to come on here and share some of those insights. But as a little thank you, I'm going to see if there's something we can do for you here, because some of the biggest names in tech and VC and business have either been guests on this podcast or might even be listening today. So is there a person you'd love to have a private breakfast or lunch with, and he or she might just be listening to this? We'll see what we can manifest together, but who would that person be and why?
You know what? I would love to. I think that I'm going to answer it in two different ways.
Yeah.
Daniel. I think there's a work answer and then there's a personal answer.
Sure.
So the work answer is I would love to get in front of the CMO of Netflix or Amazon, and one of those companies or organizations that I think have been really adaptive in the way that they've driven their business. All the things that we said about understanding the consumer challenge, I think those businesses are just really interesting to better understand. The way that Amazon has evolved their business model from everything from their technology AWS platform to the retail side of their business as well is just incredibly insightful. The way that Netflix solves for the challenges that's based on the consumers, and normally challenges that we didn't even think that we had. The idea of going to a video store and returning the video the next day and not really it was a pain, but you didn't really think there was a solution. And Netflix sort of solved that without us even realizing it was a problem. So I think those sort of organizations, any CMO to understand, or even the CEO, to understand how that business progressed. And Jeff Bezos would be brilliant. On the personal note, I'm a huge sports fan, so I'd love to be with any of the sort of high performing greats that we've got. I mean, the likes of Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Roger Federer, Wayne Gretzky from an ice hockey perspective. I'm not sure if they listen to the podcast, but I would love to have breakfast with them too, to understand their mindset and also their vision, because I think they think differently to everybody else as well, in the way that that's what's made them so great. So I'd love to tap their minds a little bit.
Wow, some big names in there. We will throw them into the ether. Let's see what we can manifest together. Hopefully we can make at least one of them work. But we covered a lot in a short amount of time today. So if anyone's listening wanted to find out more about some of the work that you published there, I know you write in a lot of places. And also we mentioned Dentsu, Merkle, and your recently published book, Shift. Where would you like to point everyone listening to find out more information?
I think you could visit either our website at merkle.com or dentsu.com. to find that information, especially when it comes to technology and our thought leadership. Obviously, please, if people are interested, take a look at our book. As you said, it's called Shift, and it's transforming motion into progress in business. It's about helping organizations move from where you implement technology. Sometimes you spin wheels and you don't really get anywhere. It's about how do you shift that motion and turn it into progress in an organization. And it's more of a storytelling book than it is a technical book. So it's designed for everybody to be able to read, and it's underpinned by a Formula One analogy as well, being sports fans as well. And Rich was a huge F1 fan. So we wanted to make it something that was easy to read. So I think those areas would be, would be where I'd point people to.
Fantastic. I just love chatting with you today. We started off quite controversially, talking about the campaign is dead, strategy is dead, but I'd love just hearing more about how it's about understanding your customer's pain point, being ready to adapt to a new trend quickly, especially when we saw last year, I think Gen AI just blindsided almost everyone at the beginning of this year, should I say. And it's about identifying emerging trends, anticipating changing customer and business needs to create strategies that enable change. So just thank you for taking the time to sit down and share it with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Neil.
Wow, what an incredibly cool guy. A dynamo in the world of customer experience and digital transformation. And so refreshing to hear around the changing tides of marketing strategies and customer centricity. Because I think the agility and adaptability that he talked about today go way beyond buzzwords. They are foundational elements for succeeding in today's volatile digital landscape. But as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything we talked about. Today. Simply email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilCHughes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything we talked about. So keep those thoughts, questions, insights, whatever they may be, pitches to come on the show, whatever it might be, let me know. Other than that, it's quitting time for me. I'm going to prepare for tomorrow's guest, but I'm going to have a little bit of R&R right now and settle into and prepare for a new season of Football Manager. But more than anything, just a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.